One of the strongest pillars of digital transformation today is definitely got to be application modernization. Now, when you think about application modernization, the first thing that comes to your mind is containers. Now, what are containers? So, containers, you can think like a regular container that's on the ship, which basically contains pretty much anything and everything inside that container. So, which basically means in the technology space, it has the ability to contain all the nitty-gritties of an application inside a container, and which kind of abstracts it from an outside world. So what are some of the benefits of using containers? One of the biggest benefit of using containers is it uses much lesser system resources than a conventional hardware, an application that's deployed on a conventional hardware or even a virtual machine. The other benefit that you can think of is the portability. You're able to seamlessly port an application from one infrastructure to the other as seamlessly as you can. And the third benefit that comes to my mind is definitely the elasticity, which means the containers can scale out and scale in, in terms of resources as and when the application needs. So it's very easier to scale your applications. And the fourth, but not the last, is that comes to my mind is the DevOps methodology, which means continuous integration and continuous deployment, which is also popularly known as CI/CD, that you associate normally with DevOps, which means you as an organization are able to add more features and bring agility into your application development paradigm. Hi and welcome back, and thanks again for tuning into Jayant on Cloud. My name is Jayant. I work as a Senior Principal Engineering Technologist at Dell Technologies. And thank you for subscribing. In fact, I've reached 100 subscribers as on yesterday. So thanks again. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified as and when I upload new videos. And if you're kind of wondering what's actually written on my t-shirt, so let me see. Yes, it says High Altitude Trek Team. So I love doing a lot of the high altitude treks. The one that I did last time was the Kuwari Pass that's in Uttarakhand. So if you're into high altitude treks, I would definitely encourage you to do it. I actually went through an organization called India Hikes. So if you're keen, Google and look up India Hikes, probably one of the premier trekking organizations in India. All right, so getting back to the topic of containers. Now, you know how important containers are today. So let's look at what is a Microsoft way of, implementing these containers distributions. So they have something known as Azure Kubernetes Service. In fact, it's popularly known as AKS. AKS is by far probably, if I'm not wrong, the third most popular container distributions out there. So what they've done is basically they've brought the goodness of AKS that's actually in public Azure today into Azure Stack HCI. So in this episode, we're going to delve into probably look at an overview of what is AKS on Azure Stack HCI, and probably in my subsequent episodes, probably we will also delve deeper into deploying AKS on Azure Stack HCI. All right, so without much ado, let's get cracking.
Azure Kubernetes Service is kind of a segue in kind of transforming their modernizing their traditional applications. It could be in the edge or in the core. So this AKS gives a way and a method for customers to run not only their traditional VM infrastructure, but also think about how they can deploy and manage applications differently using Kubernetes-based applications. So we're going to see through the presentation as I start doing the demos and stuff. It opens up the door for running additional Azure services also. That's a goodness of how AKS has been really built and baked into this platform. So Microsoft's eventually goal is to expose some Azure services and target to Azure AKS clusters, which is actually running on Azure Stack HCI nodes. So obviously, I'm not going to talk about what is Kubernetes, and that's something that I would assume the audience is already comfortable having that kind of a conversation. But I will touch upon some of the, what are some of the AKS strengths and weaknesses and so on, right? Not weaknesses, but mostly focus on what are some of the strengths of Azure Stack HCI. So the ones that are highlighted is something that I'm going to focus on. Obviously, other bullet points is something that most of our Kubernetes distribution can already do today. But what AKS does it differently is provide ability to administrators to deploy and manage both Linux and Windows-based container apps within the same management cluster, right? So that is a biggest differentiator in my opinion. And needless to say, the Arc. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Azure Arc. So as industry and is going gaga about the multi-cloud approach, I think Azure Arc is right up there to make that a dream a reality. So for many organizations today. So Azure Arc is basically provides that neat interface or the glue between public cloud and on-premises infrastructure, or even public cloud with Azure and any other public cloud, for instance. So thereby, customers can seamlessly govern, manage, deploy, and all of their applications, irrespective of where these applications would reside. It could be running on a bare metal server on their traditional infrastructure, or it could be on an HCI node like an Azure Stack HCI infrastructure on premises, or it could be a virtual machine which is hosted on Google Cloud or AWS, for instance. Now, all of these disparate infrastructure can be managed from a single endpoint, which is Azure, from an Azure control plane, a single pane of glass, like it's popularly called, using Azure Arc. I think that's the biggest differentiator, especially when it comes to AKS, because AKS with Azure Arc, as you can see in my next few slides, as to how it powers customers to bring those Azure services to be able to run on Azure Stack HCI nodes. So this is Kubernetes on Azure. It's built-in class for practices like Microsoft comes with a lot of learnings running AKS. So AKS on public Azure is not new, right? So Microsoft has been there, done it. It's one of the top 3 most popular container distribution that's out there in the market. So AKS in Azure is absolutely very popular and comes with the experience of thousands of enterprises successfully running AKS on Azure. Now, what Microsoft is trying to do is transfer this knowledge to many of their products, like AKS on Azure Stack HCI. That's the eventual end goal of Microsoft. So security has always been built and baked into public Azure. Microsoft has invested heavily across different layers of the stack, like for instance, compute, storage, and network, to ensure every layer of the stack is heavily isolated. And a lot of these learnings and the technology is now coming to AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So as you can see, all the goodness of AKS on Azure is actually dumped straight into AKS on Azure Stack HCI. Microsoft has a very, very rich established support ecosystem across AKS on Azure, and the same engineers have been trained to handle AKS and Azure Stack HCI. In fact, I want to give you a classic example of a real-time one where one of our customers, where we were doing a demo, had some issues with deploying AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So we actually engaged the Microsoft support specialists, and these support specialists turned out to be AKS support specialists in public Azure. Okay, so they've been trained to actually also support AKS on Azure Stack HCI. One other thing is the unified management. This plays a significant role in the overall benefit of the AKS on Azure Stack HCI, and combine that with Azure, right? So unified management is really at the crux of AKS on Azure Stack HCI, because customers today who are embracing public cloud to run some of their applications there is definitely a need to run some of the other applications on premises, right? So to meet their regulatory needs and so on. So when they're doing so, they want to have this, basically they don't want to have a disparate experience managing these two, paradigm. So this is where governance or using technologies such as Azure Arc helps them achieve the kind of unified experience using a single pane of glass control plane, which I'm going to show you in the real demo when I do it. So what does it really mean for AKS on Azure Stack HCI, right? So it is built with Azure hybrid by design. So AKS on Azure Stack HCI takes, like I said, a ton of that goodness that is engineered with Azure and brings it to the edge or core data center through Azure Stack HCI. So in a way, it's kind of easy for customers to consume and deploy, right? And the goodness is it's also consistent with what the industry, like the Kubernetes in the industry is doing, and more importantly, with Azure. So it's, when I think about AKS on Azure Stack HCI, if I see a customer and say, hey, where do I position OpenShift, let's say Tanzu or AKS? I mean, AKS bakes in really beautifully for a Microsoft ecosystem, right? But it also brings the goodness of the open source that Kubernetes brings in to AKS. But if you really think about if the customer really wants to extract the true value of AKS on Azure Stack, a true value of Kubernetes on their platform, running Windows kind of workloads or a Microsoft heavy shop with Azure, AKS on Azure Stack HCI is a go-to solution. .NET applications, today it's a fantastic platform for modernizing .NET application on-prem. As you know, today .NET applications can also be run on Linux, right? So this is a great conversation for us to have, especially for customers. There are thousands of .NET applications which are lying there, which is being traditionally run on a virtualized platform. So it's a great conversation for us to have. If you see a customer who is running a .NET application and say, are you thinking about a modernization story? Then we can position AKS on Azure Stack HCI. Security, like I discussed in the previous slide, right? All of this is built with security at the center, such as, we have seamless integration with Azure AD for identity management, and making sure containers are up to date. In fact, Microsoft has one of the fastest update lifecycle of Kubernetes updates that are available today in the market for Azure Stack HCI, AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So, and it also gives you the ability to integrate with key vaults and RBACs and all of that goodness that you see from public Azure today. So a little bit going deeper, diving deeper into the Azure Stack AKS architecture. So as you can see, the underlying, it's best run on AX nodes today, which is the underlying architecture for Azure Stack HCI. If you look at the second layer, right? So bunch of the virtual machines, it basically runs up a few virtual machines just to power AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So this is the first layer of value AKS brings to Azure Stack HCI, right? So it provides this automatic rollout of these necessary VMs to support this, apps and workloads for the customers. The term automatically updating here that you see in the slide can be misleading at times, but there is still a amount of manual work that is involved to download some of the images from public Azure. But still, you can run all of these using PowerShell commands as well. And also, we have a GUI to orchestrate all of this, which I'll do a demonstration, which you will see in the demonstration. If you look at the middle layer, so this is where so when Kubernetes does orchestration, it is obviously creating a lot of nodes to run containers and pools, and it's also creating a network. It's creating a VM disk somewhere, and storing it somewhere in the storage subsystem. So all of this needs to integrate with the underlying platform. So this is where Azure Stack HCI and Microsoft engineers have spent some time designing this middle layer, which is a CSI, CNI cluster APIs to work with the underlying Azure Stack HCI subsystem, right? So this is where the effort has gone in to literally dump AKS from public Azure and take the same code and build on top of AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So this is where the engineering effort from Microsoft has gone in. So, and if you go into the next layer, which is the Kubernetes.io, there's an open source code from AKS on Azure. Anything that Microsoft innovates in or Azure brings those values seamlessly, they will be bringing it to AKS on Azure Stack HCI for sure. So as you can see, all of these services, which is the management, the Microsoft provided OSS code, the Kubernetes IO platform, all of this actually is contained within a package today. Okay. Now, optionally, the top layer, if you see, optionally, customers, if they feel there is a need, they can onboard these clusters onto Azure Arc. It could be any CNCF compliant Kubernetes clusters, but Azure Arc is with AKS is a great game changer because Azure Arc is a chargeable service on any non-AKS Kubernetes distribution there. So whereas if it's AKS, most of the management is absolutely free of cost. Only you will be charged for the workload clusters. Okay, so that's one of the things. And not just that, if you include that inventory grouping and all the Azure constructs like tagging, deployment of applications like GitOps integration, Azure policies, absolutely free on AKS on Azure Stack HCI, while it is charged for any CNCF compliant or a non-AKS Kubernetes distribution. All right, so if you look at Azure Arc, so I just want to kind of spend some time, talking about what is Azure Arc, like I discussed. So Azure Arc today, you can have basically into two different buckets. One is you can project resources to Azure from on-premises, or you can project resources from Azure to on-premises. So both of them is doable. So you can project from on-premises to Azure or vice versa, Azure to on-premises. So projection out from Azure, it provides that ability to run Azure services outside of Azure on top of Kubernetes on HCI. For instance, we're going to talk about AKS on Azure Stack HCI. It's going to be an incredible enabler for running those as many Azure services, which I'll show you what are those services today available right now in public preview, but some of the services are generally available, for example, SQL as a database, like data services. But for example, Azure App Service, Azure Functions, Azure Logic Apps, all of this today is in public preview, and they are going to be seamlessly be able to run on AKS clusters running on Azure Stack HCI on premises. In case of projection to Azure, for instance, like I talked about, you can project pretty much anything. It could be, a virtual machine that's running on non-Microsoft platform. It could be ESXi, for instance, or it could be a virtual machine which is running anywhere in public cloud, or simply a server which is running on a bare metal. So all of this can be projected out to public Azure as well. All right, so if you look at the AKS HCI components, right? So this is I'm sure it's a familiar architecture with most Kubernetes distribution. If you look at the mechanics of AKS on HCI, so there's a cloud agent that gets deployed on the underlying cluster, which is obviously being powered by Dell PowerEdge AX nodes. And cloud agents gets deployed on each physical node. So obviously this is a failover kind of a Windows clustering that you deploy and that you create for the first time. So when you deploy AKS on Azure Stack HCI, what first gets deployed is a management cluster. Okay, so management cluster is also known as KVA or a resource bridge. So it's something like a mini cluster running on a single VM. So just keep that in mind. So it's running today on single VM with necessary APIs and load balancers, cluster configurations. So whose job basically is to purely to orchestrate the deployment that will run the customer's applications. So it's basically a standalone management cluster, which is basically used for orchestrating deployment of the target cluster or a workload cluster, if you will. So management cluster here is what administrator would usually deploy, right? You can do a deployment, you can do an upgrade, you can do a deletion, All of that can be done today. It gives that management interface to administrator to manage the overall AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So you may be wondering, is it a single VM? Yes, today, fortunately, it's still a single VM, but built on high availability, a virtual machine which can live migrate from one node to the other if the nodes were to fail in the cluster. But having said that, in the future, there may be an option to deploy multiple management VMs for the management cluster. Okay, so just keep that in mind. There's absolutely no charge associated with the management cluster. And then you talk about the target cluster or the workload cluster. So there is a load balancer here. Now, the good news is customers can also bring in their own load balancer, which is bring your own LB, like F5, for instance. They can also do that, right? And then you look at the control plane. This is where really the brain of the AKS clusters. This is where all the orchestration would happen to ensure updation, deletion, scaling, all that you associate normally with Kubernetes. The worker nodes, you got usually worker nodes themselves is where you deploy your Windows worker nodes or Linux worker nodes. I think that's very, very important to note here. AKS on Azure Stack HCI today supports both, Windows as well as Linux worker nodes. Currently, we don't support bringing your own images yet. So Microsoft has a Marina OS for Linux distributions and Windows Server 2019. So I know 2022 is out, but still 2022 is not available as an image, but 2019 is what is available today to run their Windows containers. So all of this is today provided by Microsoft, which means you have to download from Microsoft repo. So this basically gives you that the automatic scheduling of Kubernetes depending on the utilization. Example, for instance, right? If an application needs a GPU, it will be smart enough not to schedule that particular workload onto a container node which does not have a GPU. So all that intelligence is baked into this control plane. And really, if you look at this, the hybrid by design, right? So you have the underlying nodes which are typically run to run the Azure Stack HCI operating system, which are best run today on Dell AX nodes. Currently, its shipping version of the Azure Stack HCI is 21H2. 22H2 is slated to be released very soon. So we know it actually provides a high performance, scalable, redundant, and reliable for traditional applications running on virtual machines or Linux or, for instance, VDI. But with Azure Arc, there is really more and more value that Azure Stack HCI brings in, right? Basically, the visibility of the HCI cluster. You can integrate the Azure policies. You can do update management and monitoring. Classic example is, hey, I have a port that needs to be enabled on a particular virtual machine, right? It could be on an AKS or it could be on a standard VM that's running on Azure Stack HCI cluster. So, or a VM that's running on an ESXi environment, right? So all of this today can be managed from a single pane of glass using Azure Arc, using Azure policies, through which you will be able to push those governance policies, for instance, enabling a port or, for instance, complying with the complex password policies. All of that today can be tightly integrated with Azure Arc. So, and the beauty is the Azure Arc, with containers brings in additional value, right? So not only will you be able to bring the Arc-enabled Kubernetes, distribution, you can also be able to do GitOps, so which I'll be showing how customers can actually, not only deploy their AKS infrastructure on Azure Stack HCI, but it gives them the seamless pathway to realize the DevOps methodology, like for instance, Azure DevOps. Integrate that using GitOps and GitOps repo and so on and so forth, which we'll see that in the demo. So all of this, again, the Azure policies, the Azure monitor, the security from a containerization perspective, right? There's been a lot of enhancements from Azure for driving those innovations around monitoring and security with Azure Monitor and also Azure Defender. So you can bring all of those innovations that are available in public Azure to AKS on HCI. All right, so I think with that, so we have some resources that are available. I've come to the end of the presentation. There are a bunch of resources that are available today. You can evaluate AKS. So the good news is, if you really want to evaluate AKS on Azure Stack HCI, it comes with 60 days of free licensing. So which means you can run it as an evaluation mode and get an idea about how this entire thing works. There's also Azure Arc Jumpstart that's available. There's a product page where all of these links I'm going to be sharing with you.
All right, so with that, I've come to the end of this episode. So just to summarize, in this episode, we looked at what is AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So in my subsequent episodes, probably we'll delve deeper into how to deploy an AKS cluster on Azure Stack HCI, and also see how to take advantage of probably deploying some of the Azure services onto AKS that's running on Azure Stack HCI. Thanks again, and if you have any feedbacks, comments, please put them in the comment section. Until then, stay safe and stay tuned.